We are delighted once more to welcome celebrated author, correspondent, and filmmaker Hedrick Smith to City Club. Mr. Smith was a correspondent, then a bureau chief for the New York Times. His team produced the Pentagon Papers series that won the Pulitzer Prize. Many of you have seen some or all of his 28 Frontline special documentaries, including the 2 Emmy Award winners, Can You Afford to Retire? And The Wall Street Fix. His 5 books include Who Stole the American Dream and The Power Game, How Washington Works, which is a mystery to most of us. So please join me now in welcoming Hedrick Smith.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you all for being here. I love coming to Bellingham. You got a great... I love it. You got a great city and a great part of the country. In fact, my wife and I are so enchanted with this part of the country that we bought a home on Orcas Island. So we're here every summer enjoying this absolutely gorgeous part of the country and your lifestyle and your values. Although I have to say, I'm a little puzzled by the media here. I picked up the Seattle Times this morning. It says, the headline says, in Everett, Trump tries to draw in black voters. I didn't know whether that was a headline or a cartoon. It's not about, pro or anti-Trump. I just didn't know there were that many black voters to begin with in Everett. And then on top of that, you could go to Gary, Indiana, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Youngstown, Ohio. There are a lot of places you'd go other than Everett. Maybe you'll forgive me. You're not dressed in a jacket. I think I'm going to take my jacket off, if I may. Thank you. I would like to talk about the election today, and I think you will be interested, and you're interested to hear about it. But I'm not going to talk about it in the typical way. I'm not so interested in the horse race. I'm not going to talk a lot about Donald and Hillary. What I'm really interested in is sharing with you some thoughts about what this election tells us about America. Think of the election, instead of a race to somewhere, as an MRI on our country. And if you look into the MRI, what does it tell us about the innards of this country? Okay, what it tells us is that we are having a very atypical election, and not just atypical because we got one bombastic speaker who goes off in many different directions. It's different because most American elections are about a battle between right and left, between conservative and liberal, between Republican and Democrat. They're ideological, and they're on what you might call a horizontal axis. This is on a vertical axis. This is a bottom-up election. This is an election of populism against the elite, of populism against the establishment. It's a mutiny. Let's go back a ways. Bernie Sanders on the left is revolting against the Democratic establishment, against Wall Street, Wall Streeters who were deep in the Clinton administration, the first Bill Clinton administration, okay, against very powerful economic leaders in Silicon Valley. He's talking about a system that's rigged on behalf of the elite, on behalf of the 1%, rigged economically and rigged politically. And he's talking about a revolution, not a violent revolution, but a political revolution. That is a bottom-up appeal. And 14 million people, gave him victories in 22 states, which is enormously unusual for that to happen. And on the other side, Donald Trump, when you go back to the primary season, and if you can for a moment suspend your memory on a number of the ridiculous things that he said and just try to understand what it is that's keeping millions of people following Donald Trump today, despite what he has said about other things. It is an enormous sense of anger and grievance on the part of working class Americans that they have been left out of the growth and prosperity of this great country of ours. We're talking about tens of millions of people who have been shoved out of good, often union jobs, blue-collar jobs, seen their jobs transported across particularly the Pacific Ocean, to China, to Korea, to the Philippines, to Bangladesh, to Vietnam, and they feel left out. They feel insecure. They can't cope with the future of their own lives. They see a prospect that their kids are going to be living worse than they have lived, and they feel very unhappy about where they are. And he is saying to them repeatedly, it's the trade agreements negotiated by both leaders in both parties, with Korea, with China, with Central America, and now with the Pacific Ocean. I'm going to rip up those agreements, and I'm going to make it fair again, and I'm going to make America great again, not just for America, but particularly for those millions of you who feel left out of the American dream today. Think about it. There are legions of people, particularly young people, who have flocked to Bernie's banner. There are all these blue-collar workers who flock to Trump's banner. Hillary is expressing the frustration of women who are held down by a glass ceiling and who want equal pay. That is another economic bellyache that is bothering the gut of this country. And it's all across the board. And young people with $1.2 trillion of student debt. Let me say that again, $1.2 trillion of student debt. The average kid comes out of a four-year college today with a $29,000 debt. What do? They run home to cut the rent. They don't get married as soon. They don't form families as quick. They don't buy cars. They don't buy consumer goods like refrigerators and washing machines and so forth. It actually is a drag on the growth of this economy. There's all this aching unhappiness that is moving and driving the agenda of this election. This election is about the middle class. This election is about, the issue is economic inequality. Whenever we get back to substance and get off the circus, and the media loves the circus. I've been in the middle of the media. The media loves a clown because it's a great story and people want to read about it. There's a kind of Gawker effect that's at work among all of us. This is what's going on. And what does this say about where we are as a country? What's interesting to me, my colleagues in the press love to quote polls. And they'll tell you the president's rating is below 50%, and that's really bad. It's now actually above 50%. They'll tell you that the Republican Party's rating is down around 20%. They'll tell you Congress is down about 13%. I want to admit immediately we in the media are right down there with Congress and priests and all the other establishment institutions. People don't trust anything right now, right? But the polls that really matter are not the ones that are addressed up to a particular individual or a particular political party. It is the polling that tells us that confidence in the American political system today is at its lowest point in 40 years. In the political system. It's not just the personalities. It's the system. I saw a poll that absolutely stunned me about 6 months ago. It said that 60% of Americans believe America is in decline. Another poll later on said 63%, in decline. Our country has seen its best days as a judgment of a majority of Americans today. The kids are going to live a life not as good as ours, and the grandkids even worse. So when somebody says, I'm going to make America great again, no wonder it appeals. You don't like where you are. You want to get to somewhere else. But the important thing is that judgment. You know, I look at Washington. I live in Washington when I'm not lucky enough to be out on Orcas Island and here in Bellingham. And it's dysfunctional. I mean, we can't pass a budget. People think, the press reports when they pass a continuing resolution that Congress has passed a budget. A continuing resolution is a recognition that you couldn't pass a budget. A continuing resolution is kicking the ball down the field. It's saying we're going to continue doing what we've been doing because we can't agree on what we should do. Okay, so understand that. We got immigration problems. We got climate change. We got, if you're worried about the budget deficit, if you're worried about the entitlements, the Social Security, Medicare, whatever it is, there's no issue we can deal with. We have a busted government. You can't just point to one party. You can't just point to one set of people. You can't just elect somebody to wave a magic wand and get it fixed. The system is broken. And I'm not the only one who's saying that. You know, I read poll after poll, 60, 70%, 75%. In one poll, 91% said the political system in America is broken. That's what we have. Now, what we have then to deal with is enormous disenchantment. Whoever wins next January has got an impossible job, okay? John Gardner, who was the founder of Common Cause and a Republican who served in the cabinet of Lyndon Johnson, said some years ago, and this is before the downturn of 2008, he said, "We are walking the edge of a precipice here. Civilizations die of disenchantment." He didn't say parties. He didn't say the next 4 years. He didn't say Obama or Clinton or Trump or Bush. He said civilizations die of disenchantment. If enough people lose faith in their society, the whole thing begins to unravel. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're honest with yourself, this is where we are in America today. We're a highly divided society. We're divided by money, first of all, the 1% and the 99%. We're divided by political power and political access, the ability to reach the people who make decisions about public policy and influence those decisions. And we're divided by who we trust. One of the reasons why people in an audience like this can look at a candidate like Donald Trump and say, how can 10,000 people have shown up in Everett at that rally last night, given some of the things that Donald Trump said? And other people will say, how can 10,000 people show up for Hillary Clinton and so forth? The answer is different people find different institutions that they trust. We don't have a common basis for trust in the society now. And that's almost as important a division as the division economically and politically. When I left Williams College, I was fortunate enough to go to Oxford. And in Oxford, I read a study of history by Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian who wrote a 12-volume history of human civilizations, 21 civilizations over 6,000 years. I want to admit right now, I did not read all 12 volumes. I read an abridgment, a 2-volume abridgment, but each one of those volumes was 1,200 pages long, so I read quite a bit. And what Toynbee said that's really relevant to us today is that civilizations rise and fall over the dynamic of challenge and response. All civilizations have a challenge. They have to meet it. If they don't meet it, they get defeated, they die, they fade away. And if they meet the challenge, then they thrive and they grow and they last longer. He goes way back. He goes back to ancient Egypt and to the Inca civilization in Central and Latin America, in Peru. And he says the challenge they faced was an interesting one, an environmental challenge. The environment was so hostile, it didn't look as though they could form an agricultural economy that would support a civilization, not just a bunch of farms sticking around, but something actually came together. Well, we know they did it. You can go down now and see the temples in Machu Picchu. So they not only had a successful agricultural economy, but they built enough excess wealth that they could go build those great temples that now exist centuries later. And the same thing along the Nile of the Egyptians, if you go back to ancient Egypt. But they fell victim to another challenge, and that is the challenge of a more powerful external military invader. In the case of the Egyptians, it was the Ottoman Turks. In the case of the Peruvian Incas, it was the Spaniards. Now, that's a challenge we know something about and we've dealt with effectively in our country. An external military challenge. It goes back, you can go back to World War I if you want, but particularly World War II, the rise of Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese. We faced that challenge. We marshaled our strength. We built the world's greatest production machine and therefore the world's greatest military machine, and we defeated them militarily. And in the Cold War, we did essentially the same thing. We just outran the Soviets technologically. And then we met them in all kinds of battlefields around the world and played to a stalemate, and then finally their system collapsed. So we know how to do that. But the challenge that Toynbee focuses on in terms of the two civilizations that matter the most to us and serve as a model to us, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, is very different. Those two societies, he said, collapsed in the end because of what Toynbee calls schisms in the soul of the society. Schisms in the body social. We would call it schisms in the body politic. Internal divisions were what led to the collapse of ancient Greece and the fratricidal war among the Greek city-states and the collapse of Rome. Starting with the assassination of Caesar, but then it goes on. It takes a couple hundred years to unfold, but nonetheless, that leads to collapse. Well, if you look at a society that's divided by money, divided by power, and divided by who people trust, you've got the makings of the schisms in the soul of a society. You've got a picture of America today. And there's one other thing that Toynbee adds that's very relevant to America today. He said one of the telltale signs of a civilization that is heading into decline is when the creative elite stops being focused on and committed to the mission of building the new creative institutions of the society and is focused primarily on increasing its own power and wealth. Now, by the creative elite, Toynbee doesn't mean the artists and the musicians and the poets. He means the Jeffersons, the Madisons, the Franklins, the Washingtons, the people who generated the institutions that enabled this incredible country of ours to take off. And if you look at the elite today, the focus of the leadership in our political and economic system is unbelievably focused on increasing its own power and wealth. So the question, how do we get into this? And how do we get out of it? Is there any way to get out of it? I wrote a book called Who Stole the American Dream, and it's a lot about how we got into it. I'm going to summarize a few points quickly. But what really interests me today, and I want to get to, is how we can get out of this mess. And people here in Washington are doing something about it, and it is possible. But we have to do it ourselves. We can't expect anybody else to do it for us. The common explanation for the inequality of income and the hyper-concentration of wealth and power in America today is globalization, is technology. You hear it from technologists, you certainly hear it from business leaders, you hear it from a number of economists, and you certainly read it often in the press. Namely, we had to get into the world, our companies had to move abroad, markets are abroad, we have to adopt modern technology, and the fate of the American middle class, the loss of all those jobs to China, the declining living standard, or the stagnant living standard of the American middle class, it's inevitable. These are all impersonal economic forces. There's nothing you can do about it. Just suck it up and get on with it. Well, there's a certain element of truth to that. In the decade of the 2000 to 2010, we lost 57,000 factories. 57,000. The percentage of the workforce in America engaged in manufacturing jobs, which are the absolute core of economic strength and a decent living standard for the middle class, went from 19% of our workforce to 9%. Kaboom, in a decade. I mean, it's unbelievable change. And by the way, it happened under both political parties. So trying to find political blame here is pretty tough to do. You can point in all directions if you want to. It is true, but it's a misleading truth because there were decisions made by corporate leaders, economic leaders, political leaders in both parties that contributed to this. What's interesting to me when I think about how we got to where we are, I look back at my own life, and I'll admit to you now that I came out of college in the middle 50s. Jayne was kind enough not to go into all those details with you. But I remember a time when it seemed as though prosperity was more widely shared. It seemed as though there were politics that worked. Yes, the Democrats and the Republicans fought, but when they got done fighting, they could actually sit down and appropriate money to send somebody to the moon, to build a national highway system, to set up Medicare and Medicaid, to pass budgets year after year. And with every budget, they had to pass several appropriations bills. I mean, things got done even though there was strong, sharp disagreement and political warfare, political combat. But what was most important to me, in my memory, was that it seemed as though an awful lot of people got along reasonably well. Well, I'm like a lot of you in this room. I have white hair, and there's a danger when people with white hair say, you know, when I was young, it was really good. Just go back and do it the way we did it when I grow up, and you'll be fixed fine. You can just hear Lyndon Johnson saying that, boy, just go back and do what we did in Texas when I was a young man, you'll be all right. You know, so I went back and checked. And what was interesting was that the productivity of the American workforce, which is the engine that drives increasing standards of living, a better life and a stronger economy, rose about 97% from the end of World War II until the late 1970s. Pretty darn good, almost doubled. And the median hourly wages and benefits of the average worker in America during that period rose 95%. 97% and 95%. What that means is the growth of the economy, the profits of the great American corporations, the efficiency of the American workforce got translated to people right at the belly, right at the middle of the American economy. Very important. All the quintiles, top 20%, bottom 20%, middle 20%, they all rose together. There are all kinds of numbers that back that up. That's a phenomenal achievement. So I thought to myself, how the hell did we do that? What did that? What drove that? So I started doing some research, and I got into a lot of it. And two things came out to be critically important: ideas and power. Whenever you're looking at how history moves, look at ideas and look at power. A lot of people think ideas don't matter. They matter enormously. The idea that mattered during that period, that ensured that widely shared prosperity, was what you might call stakeholder capitalism. It was the idea that the job of the CEO, Charlie Wilson at General Motors, Reg Jones at General Electric, Frank Abrams at Standard Oil of New Jersey, now ExxonMobil, and so Remington at Coke, on and on, Irving Shapiro at DuPont, on and on. They believed that the job of the CEO was to balance the economic interests of the different stakeholders in the corporation. That is, the different groups that had a stake in the success and survival of that corporation. Now, obviously, that includes the owners, the stockholders. It includes the managers. But it also includes the employees. It includes the communities in which they have factories or they have offices. It includes the musicians, I'm joking, who have cell phones. It includes the banks that provide credit. It includes the people who make the parts that go into the aircraft. I mean, you've got it up here with Boeing and so forth. You can see it real clearly. So it's a whole diverse variety. But the point was, the CEO saw himself. And these guys, I went back and I read it. They actually said it. We have a moral responsibility to do this. This is our civic duty. This is smart capitalism. They called it the virtuous circle of growth. They said it's smart business. And it's smart economics to pay more people well, to pay the middle-class workers well. Why? If you pay tens of millions of Americans, middle-class Americans, a decent wage with decent benefits and decent retirement, decent health benefits, so they'll go out and spend the money. I mean, Americans in good times spend 95% of their money. They save about 5% on their mortgage. And in bad times, they spend about 105% of their income. So that's what drives growth. People talk about the job creators in Washington as if it's the top 1% on Wall Street. Top 1% of Wall Street has been sitting on $2 trillion of savings in American corporations for the last 4 years. The job creators in America are in this room. It's people like us. It's people like you. It's you're earning enough money or enough retirement or whatever it is and spending that money that makes the economy here in Bellingham and the state of Washington and the country of the United States grow. And if you stop doing that, growth was slow. Guess what happened? Stop doing it, growth slowed down. So that was what they understood. They felt the obligation, and they saw the results. Henry Ford said it a century ago when he instituted the $5 a day at Ford. $5 at that time, he doubled the pay. Nobody before that had paid even more than $2.50 a day. He doubled it overnight. He said, not only am I going to keep my workers, and there were a lot of other things Henry Ford said that we might not like or agree with, but on this point, Henry Ford was on target. And he said, if I pay my workers a good salary, then they can afford to buy the Ford motor cars, the Model Ts that we're rolling off our assembly lines. And to bring it forward, and Charlie Wilson and Reg Jones and all those other CEOs that I mentioned, they said exactly the same thing in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s. Okay? That's the first thing that mattered. I'm going to get to how that changed in a moment. The second thing that mattered was power. Now, we've forgotten it. We've forgotten it. I saw it first in 1960. I happened to be a correspondent for United Press International in Nashville, Tennessee, when the sit-ins began. They led to the Freedom Rides, they led to Birmingham and Jackson and the March on Washington. all those things I covered as a young reporter. It was a group of people saying, we want in. Yes, we're angry. Yes, we're protesting, but we want in. We want into the American dream. We want to take part of it. There was a women's movement. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique 51 years ago. 2 years later, John F. Kennedy signed the first piece of legislation against gender discrimination in pay. Didn't go far enough. At that time, women were making 41 cents on the dollar to what men were making for doing the same work. Today, it's up around 80 cents. It differs in various different fields. We're not all the way there yet. We got a ways to go. But we're a long ways away from where we were. And those women, they weren't passive. I don't know about you guys when you're sitting there, but I remember the first time I began to see women going braless. I didn't know what the hell to do about it. What are they doing? Why are women going braless? And they were particularly endowed. It was a lot of fun, but there was more point to it. What they were saying was, notice us, pay attention, give us a fair break, stop ignoring us, stop looking past us, see us. And life began to change. And then a guy named Ralph Nader writes Unsafe at Any Speed. And boom, you start to see the consumer movement grow. In 1 year, 1961, there were 11 new consumer organizations formed. They eventually combined forces into the Consumer Federation of America, now a very important institution in Washington, D.C. People started saying, wait a second. Nader said, my God, Detroit is producing cars with mechanical defects that are causing accidents that are maiming and killing people. And what did we do last year? We recalled 26 million cars because Detroit is making cars that have defects that are causing accidents that are killing people. So we still got the problem. But what Nader did was he hit the thunderclap on a consumer movement. And the next thing you know, women are saying, wait a second, I bought a box of soap last month, and it was smaller than this, and this one is bigger, but it feels lighter. That doesn't seem right. And so they started saying, we want honesty in packaging. We want weights and measures and contents and one thing. If you walk into a store today and you turn over the box or the tube or whatever it is you're picking up and look on it to see what the contents are, to see whether or not you want to put it in your mouth, put it on your face, or feed it to your family, you can thank the consumers movement of the 1960s and 70s because they got those laws written. And they didn't sit at home. They went out and they demonstrated. Now, the biggest example is right out there, this wonderful green. Earth Day, 1970. Do you have any idea how many Americans went into the streets, went to college campuses, went to shopping malls, went to radio and television stations that had talkathons? 20 million Americans. Have any idea how many people went anywhere and protested on the environment last April 20th? Not very many. People were engaged. They got up. They did something. And guess what happened? Within 1 year, Congress passed 7 major pieces of environmental legislation. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Anti-Toxic Substance Act, on and on and on. All of them but one, signed by that great environmentalist, Richard Nixon. I know Bill Ruckelshaus. He's a personal friend of mine. You know him. He lives down in Seattle. I knew him. He was one of the guys who revealed that Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover had wiretapped my home telephone. But that's a side story. But I said to him, Bill, he was the first head of the Environmental Protection Agency under Nixon. I said, was Nixon a closet greenie? Did I miss something here? What was going on? He said, Rick, in all the years I worked for Nixon, he never once said, is it really bad out there, Bill? Is it true that if you put your arm in the Potomac River and pull it out, it gets covered with green slime because of the pollution of phosphorus and nitrogen that's causing all the algae down there? He said, no. He said, Nixon said to me, he said, when you get over there, Bill, he said, don't let the bureaucrats at EPA capture you. Ruckelshaus looked at me. He said, Nixon was the only person in Washington. He had founded the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. He was the only person in Washington who thought the acronym for EPA was EPA. He said, that's how engaged he was. I said, so why did he do it? He said he had to do it. The people spoke. The people demanded. By the way, the environmental legislation that got passed during that period, the votes were like 90-2, 89-3, nearly 97, one of them. I mean, it was overwhelming. The bipartisan was just enormous support. He just said, Nixon was a practical politician. He went with what the people wanted. That's the way democracy is supposed to work. Power. Power in the women's movement, power in the black movement, power in the labor movement. Enormously important, not just for union members, but for people all across the society. The agreement struck initially in 1950 between General Motors and the United Auto Workers Union became a template for the auto industry, for the steel industry, for the rubber industry, for the power industry, and for lots of non-unionized companies all across America. There was a social compact. The idea was you lifted all boats. And you lifted all boats by sharing the wealth, and that helped generate more growth. And by the way, what's really interesting is if you go back to that period, during Eisenhower, the 1950s, Republican president, the maximum marginal tax rate was 92%. Talk about that today, and people would say the economy will come to an absolute dead halt. It got dropped down by Kennedy, Democratic president, during the 1960s to 77%. The annual average growth rate in those 2 decades was a little bit over 3%. Fast forward to 2000, Republican President Bush, Democratic President Obama, maximum marginal tax rate 35%, average annual growth rate a little over 1%. High taxes, 3% growth, low taxes, 1% growth, okay? I'm not saying that taxes actually drive the growth. What I'm saying is they don't have anything to do with the growth. Other things are going on. It's the consumer demand that's driving the growth. It's not the tax rate. So don't let anybody sell you during this election that cutting the taxes on the people at the top is going to generate growth. I'm not making a partisan statement. That is a factual statement, because if you go back and look at the track record of American history, there's nothing that supports that contention, okay? Congressional Research Service has done a study on it, and it's all out there for people to find if they want. And they're the ones who provide the research for Congress. So power and ideas led to this shared prosperity. And what happened since then was a tremendous change. We had Milton Friedman, a Chicago economist who won a Nobel Prize for his monetary policy thinking, said there's only one job of the CEO, is to deliver maximum return to shareholders. Forget this business about helping the stakeholders. Forget this business about raising wages. Just deliver the maximum profit to shareholders and drive up the price of the stock. Well, what happened is that has stagnated wages over the last 32 years, from the late 70s to about 2011, 2012. 84% of the growth of the entire nation's economy, the income went to the top 1%. 84%. When I first heard the bumper slogan, 99% 1%, I thought, wow, that's a clever slogan. That's a really smart political idea. 99% 1% poses all of us against just a very small minority at the top. But it's an exaggeration. It isn't really accurate. Just a clever idea. And then I looked at those numbers. If the top 1% got 84% of all the growth, then the bottom 99% got 16%, right? 100 minus 84, 16. Which means the top 1% got 5 times as much as the entire rest of the country over 3 decades. That's astonishing. That kind of concentration of wealth is astonishing. Citibank put out a report in 2005, said there had not been such a concentration of wealth in a major economic power since 16th century Spain. That's 500 years. Now, this isn't Paul Krugman, right? This isn't some liberal economist. This isn't some wacko New York Times public television correspondent up here throwing a bunch of garbage at you. This is Citibank. You know why they did it? Because they were telling their wealthiest investors, invest in companies that cater to you, to the top 1 or 2%, because they're making the best profits. Go invest in Tiffany's. Go invest in luxury yacht builders. Go invest in high-end real estate, gated communities, whatever. And it was a very interesting study they put out. So following Friedman, we've been getting stuttering growth. The middle class wages, if you go back to that period I told you before, 97% growth in productivity, 95% growth in average wages. Fast forward the last 30 years, 80% growth in productivity, 10% growth in average wages, and mostly because more women are working more hours. In other words, the middle class is stagnated. Today, median household income, the people right at the middle of America, is lower today than it was in 1999. It is lower today than in 1999. So all those people I told you about at the beginning who were angry and upset and part of this rebellion, part of this mutiny, they have a good reason to be. We are not sharing the wealth in this society. It's not even the wealth. We're not sharing the growth. This is a surefire formula to absolutely constant slow growth. That's why we get the 1% growth in 2010, and it's going on now. Maybe we bump up and we get excited, we get 2.2%, but it'll drop back down when we have the next recession. We have a formula today that isn't working. And now quickly to the power equation, we're not engaged. Where is the citizens movement today? Where's the women's movement today? Where's the environmental movement today? Where's the labor movement today? Where are all those movements that were so powerful, that affected policy? The answer is they're starting to happen. They're starting to happen in this state. Think about it. SeaTac, a community of 23,000 people, inhabited largely by immigrants from Ethiopia, Somalia, Bosnia, Ukraine, Russia, who've never been exposed to democracy, who have no idea what the vote is, let alone what a citizens' movement is. But they get together with the SEIU, the Washington Labor Council, and they start to go to their mosques. They get organized. SeaTac becomes the first city in America to vote in a $15 minimum wage. I mean, it's unbelievable. You could not have picked a piece of political terrain that was more unlikely to have that happen. Today, the federal minimum wage sits at $7.25 an hour, as it has, I think, for the last 12 years. There are now 29 states that have a higher minimum wage than the federal minimum wage. And it includes red states like North Dakota, like Nebraska, like Alaska. It isn't just California and Washington and New York and Connecticut. This is spread, okay? If you start to look on your ballot this fall, I-735. You know what I-735 is? Anybody know? I-735 is an initiative that calls for you as voters in the state of Washington to decide whether or not you want to pass a resolution that says Congress should enact an amendment to the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, to roll back Citizens United, which cut loose unlimited corporate funds, also labor union funds and so forth, but corporations so outspend labor unions, it's ridiculous. In most political campaigns and hard money, it's 16-1 in favor of corporations. In terms of soft money, it's 90-1. So it's laughably unequal, okay? You have a chance to vote on that. 17 states have already acted and called on Congress to pass an amendment to the United States Constitution. We're stuck. Congress hasn't got enough people voting for it, but the issue's up there and people are starting to move. In this state this fall, and later this fall, I am going to South Dakota. I can hardly believe it. In South Dakota, there are 3 petitions that have been signed for and put on the ballot. One calls for gerrymander reform, breaking up the political districts that are monopolies that are written into the election ballots by the politicians to keep themselves in office. An amendment calling for a Washington state top 2 primary, a nonpartisan primary in which the top 2, regardless of party, will go into the general election, which helps rebuild the political middle, and that's already happened in your state. I hope you know about it. There's a moderate Republican from the eastern part of the state who never would be in office without that top 2 primary, okay? And there's also a conservative Democrat from Seattle who probably wouldn't be elected were it not for that. The point is, we've got people in Washington playing from both ends of the playing field, and nobody's in the middle of the field. We can't make compromises because there are no middle people anymore. We desperately need moderate Republicans and conservative Democrats, as well as conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats. We need a mix for this system of ours, designed by people with checks and balances 2 centuries ago, more than 2 centuries ago. We need that mix, or it doesn't work. Ideological extremes bring us to a dead halt. That's what we're looking at right now. So the gerrymander is important. And guess what? Nearly 90% of the districts for Congress in America today are gerrymandered. A good political reporter can tell you today what the outcome is going to be within 30, 35 districts. I follow the Cook report by Charlie Cook. He's got about 33 districts that are competitive. The rest, and most of those aren't really competitive. I mean, if you look at the toss-ups or close calls, we're down to about 15. But they didn't even bother looking at about 350, close to 400 of them. This is crazy. I mean, the whole idea of democracy was to build competition, to force people to bring their ideas and have them debated. The whole idea was to give voters a choice. If you're a Republican and you live in Massachusetts, you have no choice for Congress. It is gerrymandered by Democrats. 62% of the voters in Massachusetts are either Republican or independents. By the way, there are more independents today in America than there are either Republicans or Democrats. And among the younger generation, more than 50%. They're turning away from the parties. We got to do something that brings independence back into the game. But that's starting to happen. You will not believe what I'm going to tell you next. None of my colleagues in the press believe it. None of them. In fact, I wrote a piece that ran in the New York Times on the 21st of August talking about citizen reforms, and at one point I said 24 states are engaged in one way or another in fighting gerrymandering, and they said, we don't believe it, prove it. So I gave them a list, every single one of the states. 24 states, some of them have already done it. Washington State has an independent redistricting commission. 6 of them are having lawsuits against gerrymandering. There's all kinds of stuff going on. In South Dakota, they're having this gerrymander reform debate, and they're going to put it on the ballot, and they're going to vote on it. What I'm saying to you is, we could be at a moment in American history when we can recapture our democracy. The headline the New York Times put on my article was, "Can the states save our democracy?" Can the states save our democracy? Washington's not going to do it. As long as we talk about our political campaigns, our political system, in 2 terms, in terms of thinking one individual elected president is going to fix things, or we say they got to do it, nothing's going to happen. We have to change the pronoun. We have to recognize we're all collectively responsible for our democracy. It's only going to work. If you go to this website of mine, the top line says, it's up to us. I hope they'll turn the lights down in a minute. I want to say one thing. Martin Luther King, when I used to cover him in the South, would go around to southern churches. And he'd go around to different cities, Birmingham, Alabama, Jackson, Gadsden, Albany, Georgia, places I covered him. And they used to call him an outside agitator. That was the epithet, that was the insult that the Southern segregationists threw at him. He said, outside agitator. I wanted to see what King would say. And King came back and he said, you know, I am an agitator. I am an agitator. He said, think of your washing machine where you put your clothes. Right in the center of it, there's an agitator. And it's agitating that water, that soapy water, to knock the dirt out of your clothes. He said, that's what I'm doing. I'm agitating to knock Jim Crow, discrimination, racism out of our society. I am an agitator. We need to be agitators. Ladies and gentlemen, my contention to you today is that we all need to be a new generation of agitators for our democracy. Thank you.
How do you interpret the success of the 2 diametrically opposite but supposedly grassroots movements that sprang up, Bernie Sanders and the other one, Donald Trump's? Are they going to be lasting? And what's going to happen if Trump is not successful in his presidential bid? What do you think will happen to those forces that were unleashed?
I think that we are at a point in American history which is similar to America in about 1850. The problem of slavery was absolutely central to the politics of the country at that point. And it took quite a while to deal with them. Actually, it was before 1850 the issue became hot. But it took another decade until you got to Lincoln and you got to a civil war. I think the problem of economic inequality in this country and the failure to share prosperity adequately so that the middle class, the great bulk of American people, can live a life which is satisfying and which they can feel some sense of economic and social and personal security, I think that issue is going to be with us. It's probably going to take us another couple of decades to deal with it. I think you can see movements like Bernie Sanders' movement rise, and I wouldn't say fall, because I think Bernie Sanders has had a powerful impact and will continue to have a powerful impact on the political system and the national political debate. And the same thing true of Trump. they've tapped into something that is absolutely fundamental, which is why I talked about that today rather than talking about the candidates. That is those movements and those issues are going to far outlive this campaign and these individuals. We're stuck with those issues. We're stuck with the schisms in the soul of society that Arnold Toynbee talked about. And until we deal with those, we're going to have these come back to us with different candidates in one form or another, in one election or another, for the next couple of decades.
So we remember when Obama got elected, and Mitch McConnell stated that his goal was to make sure he was a one-term president. That didn't happen. He failed. But the policy of non-cooperation his party followed stymied the aims of this president quite a bit. And do you really think it's going to be different if Hillary gets elected? Is the power of the people that strong?
No, I don't think it's going to be different. I think that's one of the things we got to face up to. We have systemic problems unless we fix the gerrymandering. Look, John Boehner, the Republican Speaker of the House, who was tempted to make a deal across party lines with Obama, negotiated, kept pulling back, negotiated, pulling back. You can argue forever about who pulled the chair away first, but it collapsed. And the reason it collapsed is that Boehner was constantly looking back over his right shoulder at a group that is now called the Freedom Caucus, which has a membership of about 30 backbench, extreme right-wing Republicans, but their actual influence is about 45 people. They eventually got Boehner. They threw Boehner out. Those people, 43 of those 45 people, come from gerrymandered protected districts in which the primary election is the election that elects the next member of Congress. They're so gerrymandered, the general election doesn't count. And listen to these numbers. The turnout in the primary election in those districts is between 4 and 10%. Okay, so when they go and they get elected, and that tends to be the most activist, the most ideological portion of the electorate, when they go get elected by that smaller portion of people who are usually at the far end of the electorate, and you then have, this was shown in the government shutdowns of 2012, 2014, this group wanted to shut the government down. Boehner didn't want to shut the government down. That's one reason why they went against him. Back in their districts, with those 7 to 10% of voters, shutting the government down is a majority opinion. Not in the district as a whole, but in the district voters that turn out in the primary. So as long as we have A, party primaries, and B, gerrymandered districts, Hillary's not going to get done what she wants to get done unless the Democrats win both the House and the Senate. And that will only be temporary. Remember that happened with Obama. Whatever Obama got done happened between 2009 and 2010 because with the election of 2010, they lost the advantage they had. They needed a 60-vote majority in the Senate to break filibusters. They lost the seats there. So unless there is a real wave, and the waves, you have to understand, waves only occur periodically. They're only good for a couple of years. That's no way for us to settle things. I mean, if you're a Democrat, you're going to say, sure, let's cheer for it. We want to win them all, and I can understand that. And in terms of our government doing something, I can understand that. But that's not going to solve the problem. Solving the problem involves getting the influence of big money out of politics and fixing gerrymandering. We have to do those things. If we don't do those things, we're going to continue to have this problem, and your kids are going to face the same thing, and somebody's going to be speaking here in 20 years saying the same kind of thing I'm saying today. We don't want that to happen in this country. We're better than that.
One thing I didn't hear while you were talking was the influence of race as how it influences the body politic and how that's being used by the far right in this country. And I think that's a lot of the energy behind Donald Trump that's going to keep that movement going. Could you comment on that, please? Sure.
Well, I think that race obviously has been a very important factor. I think that when Obama was elected in 2008, there were a lot of us, and I include myself, who had the naive expectation that somehow with the election of a black president, and particularly a black president who had not been deeply involved personally in the civil rights movement, so he wasn't sort of a combatant for civil rights, that we had somehow reached a point where we could not get beyond racism, but get beyond it to a certain point. It is clear to me, and I've been a reporter in Washington since 1962, I have never seen the level of personal animosity towards a president that I've seen towards Obama. And it is very difficult to explain on either issue grounds or even partisan grounds. I mean, there's no question that race is a factor. And I suspect that the feelings, not suppressed, but the emergent feelings against Obama, which got directed often against Obamacare as a policy because it had his name on it and was his trademark, is part of what Trump is deliberately tapping into, that there is that feeling there, and that's part of the anger that you find among particularly white middle-class male workers, particularly those who have not had a four-year college degree, whose economic perspective is tough. And I have to tell you, as a kid who lived the teenage years in Greenville, South Carolina, where my family lived, who covered civil rights in the early 60s, this is exactly the card that segregationist politicians played all across Dixie. They played on the anxieties of white blue-collar workers who saw blacks and now Hispanics as their economic competitors and thought that either welfare programs were unfairly helping the minorities, the ethnic minorities, or that they were a threat to the jobs, the security, and the social status of the whites. Yes, there's no question it is being exploited. That compounds the problems I'm talking about. But I think that if we had had economic policies over the last 20 years, which had done more to retrain workers, to try to keep jobs at home, not to give tax advantages to corporations. There are tax advantages to corporations to moving abroad. It's utterly ridiculous. No other political system in the world offers tax advantages to its major companies to move abroad. If we'd fixed a number of those problems 20 years ago, I think the intensity of this anger and the ability of any politician, whether his name is Trump or something else, to play on that would be much less. I mean, I think the essential grievance, the essential insecurity, the appeal of the wall on the border to me, we laugh at that, but the appeal of the wall is we're going to stop those people from coming in and taking our jobs and sucking down our wages. And people who are insecure and go to the bar and have a beer with other guys who are in the same shape and they talk about that. It's not much different from the way people are at the 19th hole at a very ritzy country club and other places. I mean, we tend to feed on our frustrations and we feed them among each other. So you're right, there's a large class of people to whom that card can be played very effectively, and it is being done, no question about it.
This is a question about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange.
Could you turn it towards you?
This way?
Yep,
Okay.
great.
A question about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and how secure you think our election might be in light of these pressures?
Well, I'm going to go beyond your question and say I'm really worried about electronic voting in this country. And I think that we tend in America to assume that technology will give us an answer. And if we just get the right technology, we'll be okay. I don't know if you saw the story the other day that the FBI has found evidence that the voting systems in Illinois and Arkansas have been hacked. That is an extraordinarily scary idea, that anybody could hack into the electronic systems and then, I mean, particularly having the Russians do it, the suspicion is the Russians, but it doesn't matter who does it. Anybody in there able to fiddle with the actual votes. It throws our whole democracy into question. So I'm worried about that in a very serious way. Hopefully the FBI is worried about it and is tracking it. They say they are. James Comey has talked about it. I think that's a very serious concern. There are now jurisdictions that are requiring that the ballot be filled out on paper, fed into an electronic machine like a fax machine. And so it's recorded electronically and counted electronically, but you do still have the original paper ballot. And it sounds like we're going backwards technologically, but if we need to do that to protect the integrity of our elections, then we need to do it. It's absolutely essential. I mean, it's a very scary thought. Do I trust this election? I'm watching a little bit more carefully than I ever have before.
There are many political scientists that have stated that civil society organizations are on the decline, and they're no longer being used to mobilize voters and instill democratic values. And people aren't necessarily being listened to. The a representative's constituents aren't necessarily being listened to as they were before, say in the 60s or 70s. For example, the universal background checks, predominantly supported by the people, but not passed by Congress. What is stopping the people's voice or power from being translated into those policy leaders?
Well, if I could take your 4 questions in sequence. Well, no, because you're asking things that are dependent on each other that are very important. Number one, it is absolutely clear from very good academic studies that, in fact, the elite opinion is listened to by members of the Senate, members of Congress, and average opinion is not. There's a political scientist at Princeton named Marty Gillens, who, with a bunch of other political scientists, did a study of 2,000 votes in the U.S. Senate over a period of about 12 years, and they matched the votes to opinion polling among the elite and opinion polling among average people, and they found out that average opinion isn't taken into account unless it agrees with elite opinion. So there's academic evidence that what you suspect is true is absolutely true. People are right in saying government is not listening to me. So that's the answer to one question. The next question is, why aren't people active? Well, you need to turn around and ask the people in this room. Because that's the problem. Part of the difficulty, well, there are 2 problems. Part of the difficulty is everybody's looking at somebody else to do it. And that's why I keep saying it's up to us. We have to, I mean, please come to this website. If you come to this website and you go to the progress reports, you'll find out what's going on all around the country on the issue of voting rights. There are 11 states that have recently passed laws, all run by Republicans, Republican governor, Republican houses, requiring photo ID if you want to register to vote, okay? Well, initially that sounds like a not unreasonable thing. You don't want voter fraud. Well, if you go take a look at the record in those states, the amount of voter fraud is almost negligible. The danger of voter fraud I just gave you in response to this woman's question is far greater than the chance that somebody's going to vote a dead person's name or vote in 2 precincts, okay? In 4 of those states, suits were filed and federal courts have overturned those laws. So people got active. The League of Women Voters and Common Cause, first of all. People have to get active and get engaged. Democracy is not a spectator sport. I mean, it's not a sport at all, but it's not a spectator sport. So, well, the reason I say that is because I think most political reporting resembles sports reporting. It's not very much about substance. It's all about the moves and the plays and who's up and who's down, what inning we're in, and what's going to happen in the debate, who's coaching somebody, and that kind of stuff. So we have to decide we're going to get involved, and that's why I brought up the ballot issues you have. I mean, you could go on the ballot. There are a lot of activist issues on the Washington State ballot this year. There's a minimum wage thing. I mentioned I-735, I-1464 is calling for a limit on donations by lobbyists and corporations to politicians. It gives a $100 democracy voucher to every voter, and those voters can give that money to candidates of their choice to try to offset the impact of mega donors, billionaires, and corporations. It requires greater disclosure of dark money. So the answer is, you're lucky. You're in a state where there's a good deal of activism going on. A lot of other states there's not, but it's happening. It's happening in Florida, Nebraska, Arizona, Idaho, South Dakota. I mean, people are starting to get it. This system is A, broken, B, unfair, C, they're not going to fix it, D, therefore we have to do it. That's the syllogism people have got to get. It's absolutely fundamental. Can the state save our democracy? I don't know if I answered them all, but I've answered a bunch of them anyways.
Thank you so much. Can you help me understand why President Obama is supporting TPP?
Well, I think you have to understand President Obama and President Bill Clinton before him as very middle-of-the-road Democrats who find corporate support politically important, who have bought the idea that the success of America's corporations will translate into the success of the economy for everybody else, which, as you can tell, I don't agree with, right? And I think he sees it in those terms. I think there are some specific loopholes in past trade agreements, such as protection of labor, environmental protections, child labor laws, and that kind of stuff, that he feels as though have been fixed in the TPP, and therefore he's continuing to support it. But I think at this point, there's a certain amount of momentum that he's got behind it, and he can't get off the train he launched from the station himself. But I have to say, I've asked that question of myself at least a dozen times, and the explanation I've given you is the best I've come up with, and I'm not satisfied with it.
Before our next question, I wonder if you could let people know the name of the website, because
Sure.
not everybody can read it.
Yeah, can you turn the site down? The name of the website is reclaimtheamericandream.org. The name of my book is Who Stole the American Dream? That's the problem. Reclaimtheamericandream.org. I made it reclaim because my belief is that we have to reclaim it. It's ours. We can't revive it, restore it. We have a claim to it. It's ours, and we need to reclaim it back for ourselves. So the word is reclaim, not reclaiming, reclaim. It's active. It's got energy behind it, right? Reclaimtheamericandream.org. I said it 3 or 4 times, so you get it.
Patricia, do you have another question?
Yeah, you mentioned gerrymandering as a problem. In Washington State, 80% of the legislative districts are gerrymandered by the bipartisan redistricting commission. It seems that with winner-take-all elections, the temptation to gerrymander is pretty much irresistible. Most democracies in the world, yes, have a system called proportional representation. Right. Do you think that's part of what we should be agitating for?
If you're in a state like Washington State, which has gone as far as it can, yes, you can probably take the issue of reform to the next step. You got too many other states that are a lot further back. The problem is, you do have an independent redistricting commission, but the balance of power is not held by a neutral. Washington State has a very unusual redistricting commission which needs to be fixed and could be fixed very simply. It has 2 Republican members, has 2 Democratic members. It has a neutral, independent chairman who has no vote. Guess what would happen if that neutral chairman had a vote? Because what happens otherwise is you get the 2 parties bargaining with each other. All right, we'll give you Seattle, we'll take the eastern part of the state, back and forth. And furthermore, it's ingrained. And so the battle lines, and guess what else? There's another way to fix this. And that is to pass an amendment to the Washington State Constitution similar to one passed, you will not believe it, in Florida. And it says in the amendment passed by more than 60% of the Florida voters in 2010, which was a Tea Party year, if you recall, it is unconstitutional to draw district lines with the intent to favor one party over the other or to protect incumbents. Now, it says it absolutely clearly. There's no other state constitution, and the federal constitution doesn't say it that clearly. And what happened was the legislature ignored that. Common Cause and League of Women Voters went to court. The courts have thrown out 24 out of 27 of the congressional districts in Florida, and this election is going to be held under a totally new redistricting plan. You could do that in the state of Washington, and you'd have a totally different, get a redistricting commission with a neutral chairman who has a vote, and pass that resolution, your problem will change totally. It's doable. If they could do it in Florida, you can do it here. Right. And remember, they did it in the worst political environment you can imagine. And they had to get more than 60% of the vote to amend the Constitution. You don't even have to do that here unless you got money involved, I think, in the state, right?
My question is about the polls. Polls seem to me to be a simple yes or no. You talked about the company being, or the country saying, yes, we think that the country is in decline. But nobody talks about why except in very general, broad terms. And also the polls, I mean, I got a call recently saying, does this crazy thing that Donald Trump said lately make you more or less inclined to vote for him? Well, since I was never going to vote for him in the first place, my inclination hasn't changed. So could you talk about why maybe we need to get beyond the polls?
Well, there's no question we need to get beyond the polls, which is the reason why I have speeches and debates and lots of other things. I happen to be one of the editors at the New York Times back in 1976 when we began serious polling, and one of my tasks was to work on polling. there's no single question in a poll that tells you where voters are. What you're trying to do is ask a battery of questions so you can put together a picture. And what happens is that the news media will then pluck a single question out that kind of comes up with a sensational answer, and you get that played very hard. But what they're looking for is not you. They're looking for the person who actually did change as a result of that. That's what they're looking for. And the answer to that question, you're not helpful to the poller, okay? But that poll, I don't know what kind of poll it was you were taking, but if you're taking a reasonable poll, they're asking 40 or 50 questions, so that's just one of them, and there are other questions in that poll in which your answer will have been significant. But I should point out something else. There's a serious problem with polling today in America. It's better on attitudes than it is on voter choices and that kind of stuff. And the reason is we're having more and more trouble getting people to answer polls. In the first place, a lot of people, I don't know about you, but when I hear it, I hang up, I'm gone. Well, you get a lot of people gone of a particular type, and you start to get an unrepresentational poll. All right? The second thing is, in a lot of areas, cell phones are not in the battery of telephone numbers that are randomly selected by computers. Well, different people use cell phones more and different people use landlines more. And if you're trying to get a decent sample of the younger generation, you better have a pretty good chunk of cell phones in your sample. So polling is getting less and less reliable, I think not because of the problem with the single question you're talking about, but because of the resistance of people to being polled and the difficulty of reaching people in a reliable way that gets you a genuinely representative sample. And what's going on is there are a lot of people who've discovered that they can sell radio shows, newspapers, whatever, by having a poll, and they do a cheapy poll with very few numbers, not a very big sample. They don't tell you what the margin of error is. They don't run a screen. And so you have to be as sophisticated about reading polls as you do about picking a bank.
We have one more over here, I think.
I think on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you very much for your basically optimistic and positive view of what change we might make. I would like to ask you to comment, however, on the fact that you noted that there's a growing number of people who register as independent.
Yeah.
And I think it's incontrovertible that both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton have just astonishing negatives. Would you comment on the role that you think the candidacy of Jill Stein and Gary Johnson might play in this election? Thank you.
Well, I think given the negatives that both Trump and Clinton have, that we're likely to see third and fourth party candidates getting larger votes than they've gotten. I don't know enough about the history of this, but we may be going from 3 to 5% to 8 to 9%. That will be an important indicator of people's disaffection. It probably won't change the Electoral College vote. In fact, it may actually reinforce some Electoral College results. If you see it at tip, they take that much. But I think it's more important to deal with the fundamental question that you raised, and that is, why are so many people turning against the political parties? And then what can we do with that force to fix our democracy? And my answer is, I'm particularly strong, as you can tell, on gerrymander reform, but my answer is, if party primaries are excluding a growing number of people who've decided they don't want to be affiliated with a party, then they should be a force that we should mobilize to fix gerrymandering. Those people have a specific interest. Now, Washington State's a bit tougher because you have a system, but you have at least a bipartisan independent redistricting commission. But Pennsylvania, for example, is utterly ridiculous. I mean, here's a state that is 6 times voted Democratic. In the last 6 presidential elections voted Democratic. It has 1 Democratic senator and 1 Republican senator, and it's going to have a very tough, highly competitive, very interesting Senate race this year. But if you look at the congressional delegation, it is 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats. It was gerrymandered back in 2011 by the Republicans so markedly that in 2012 there were more people in Pennsylvania who voted for Democratic candidates for Congress than voted for Republicans. With an 18-member delegation, it should have come out maybe 10 to 8 Democrat or 9 to 9. It came out 13 to 5 Republican. A Democratic state senator then went and took the same vote and redrew the map of Pennsylvania, and it came out 13-5 Democratic. So that tells you what could happen. I were in Pennsylvania as a political activist. I would be going around recruiting independents, people who've given up on both. It isn't just the presidential candidates, but given up on others as well, and say, we have got to fix this system in Pennsylvania so our votes count and what the results accurately reflect how we're voting. I mean, that's utterly ridiculous. I mean, no business would accept that kind of a bargain with a supplier. It would be that lopsided. So my feeling is, and you need to understand in terms of my optimism, I'm a congenital optimist. I think that if more people knew the good stories that are happening in American politics at the state level and at the city level, more people would be encouraged to get informed. And I think the media is absolutely unconscionably irresponsible on this. They're simply not reporting it. They'll report a court decision here, or they'll vote a CTAC vote there, something like that, but they won't connect the dots for you. Our job in the media, what I've been trying to do today for you, is connect the dots. You can't understand what's going on without somebody helping build you a framework against which you can then play news developments. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.